The day I sat across from my own family. There is a moment in every person's life when everything they believed about the people they loved gets stripped away in one single instant. For me, that moment came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of Harmon and Reeves Financial Investigations. The morning sun was cutting sharp lines across the mahogany table. My coffee was still hot. My laptop was open. My case file was organized exactly the way I always organize it. Color-coded tabs, time-stamped transaction logs, a summary sheet on top. I had been working this particular fraud case for 11 days. And that morning, when my supervisor walked in and slid a folder across the table to me, I picked it up, opened the first page, and saw my grandfather's name, Gerald Raymond Whitfield. I stared at that name for a long time. Then I looked at the list of authorized signatories on the flagged account. My mother's name, my father's name, my brother Daniel's name, not mine, never mine. I set the folder down very carefully. I picked up my coffee. I took one slow sip. And then I did what I had been trained to do for the past 9 years. I opened a new case file. I typed my own family's names into the header, and I got to work. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, how does something like this happen? How does a family fall so far that one of their own ends up investigating them for financial fraud? The answer is not a simple one. It never is with families. It starts long before the fraud, long before the forged documents and the drained accounts and the secret meetings at lawyers' offices my grandfather never knew about. It starts with a story about a girl who was never quite enough. That girl was me. My name is Clara Whitfield. I am 34 years old. I have a master's degree in forensic accounting. I have spent the last 9 years of my life following money trails, uncovering hidden transactions, and building airtight cases against people who thought they were too clever to get caught. My family thought I worked at a small accounting office doing tax returns. They thought I was barely getting by. They thought I was the family disappointment, the quiet one, the one who never got the big house or the flashy car, the one who showed up to Christmas dinner in a sensible coat, while my brother Daniel showed up in a new SUV every other year. They thought a lot of things about me. Most of them were wrong. But let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand what happened in that conference room on that Tuesday morning in October, you have to understand where this family started. You have to understand who Gerald Whitfield was, and you have to understand exactly what my family was willing to do to get their hands on everything he built. Grandpa Gerald and the life he built. My grandfather, Gerald Whitfield, was not a flashy man. He grew up with very little. His father worked in a steel mill. His mother cleaned houses. They lived in a small town in Ohio where everyone knew everyone and nobody had very much. But nobody complained about it either because that was just the way things were. Gerald left that town at 18 with $70 in his pocket, and a firm belief that a man who worked hard and spent carefully could build something real. He was right. By the time he was 30, he owned a small hardware supply business. By 40, that business supplied materials to 3 counties. By 55, he had quietly accumulated properties, savings, and investments that most people in his social circle never knew existed. Gerald was not the kind of man who talked about money. He drove the same truck for 12 years. He wore the same style of boots every winter. He ate dinner at the same diner every Friday morning and always tipped the same waitress the same generous amount. He was private, careful, deeply principled, and he loved his family, genuinely, completely loved us, even when we did not deserve it. He had one son, my father, Robert Whitfield, and Robert had 2 children, my brother Daniel, who was 4 years older than me, and me, Clara. From the time I was very small, I understood that Daniel was my father's favorite. This was not a dramatic realization. It was not one painful moment. It was 1,000 quiet moments that stacked up over years until the shape of it became undeniable. Daniel got the new bike. I got the hand-me-down one. Daniel got the bigger bedroom. I got the one next to the furnace. Daniel got help with his college application. I was told I was smart enough to figure it out myself. None of it was said out loud. That was the thing about my family. The unfairness was never spoken. It was just practiced. Quietly, consistently, as naturally as breathing. My grandfather noticed. I know he noticed because of the things he would say to me when it was just the two of us. When he would take me to the hardware store on Saturday mornings and let me sit on the counter while he did inventory. When he would slip me $20 before I went back to school in September and say, "That's yours, Clara, not for the family, for you." He saw me in a way that my parents never quite did. And I know, that is why he made the plans that he made. Plans that my father and my brother eventually discovered. Plans they decided they could not allow to stand. My grandfather updated his will when I was 26 years old. I didn't know about it at the time. I found out years later through the investigation. But according to the documents he filed, he made significant changes to his estate plan in the spring of that year. His estate at that point was valued at approximately $2.3 million. That included the family property in Ohio, 2 rental homes, a commercial building he leased to a hardware distributor, and a carefully managed investment portfolio he had been building for 30 years. His original will, the one drafted when my father was young, split everything between my father and a handful of charitable organizations Gerald supported. The new will was different. The new will split the estate 3 ways: 1/3 to my father, 1/3 to a trust established in my name, structured to provide for my long-term financial security, and 1/3 to the charitable organizations. Daniel got nothing directly. My father's share was reduced significantly. My grandfather told no one about these changes. He kept the documents with his personal attorney, a man named Harold Pruitt, who had handled Gerald's legal affairs for over 20 years. He trusted Harold completely. Harold was meticulous, professional, and completely loyal to my grandfather. The problem was that Harold retired 3 years after the new will was filed, and when Harold retired, his small firm was absorbed by a larger legal practice, and somehow, in that transition, my family found out. I still don't know exactly how my father learned about the will, whether someone in the new firm was careless, whether my father hired someone to investigate, whether it was a coincidence that became an opportunity. What I know is what the documents showed me 9 years later. Within 6 months of Harold Pruitt's retirement, my father and my brother Daniel had begun a careful, deliberate campaign to dismantle everything my grandfather had planned for me. What I didn't know I was missing. I want to tell you about the years between my grandfather's will being changed and the moment I found his name in my case file. Because those years matter. They are the years when everything was happening around me, and I had no idea. I graduated with my accounting degree at 22. I worked for a mid-sized firm for 2 years doing standard audit work. I was good at it, better than good. My supervisor told me I had an unusual instinct for finding things that didn't add up. At 24, I was recruited by a firm that specialized in financial investigations. They worked with law enforcement, corporate legal teams, and estate attorneys to trace hidden assets, identify fraud, and build financial crime cases. I loved it immediately. There is something deeply satisfying about following a money trail. Money always moves. It always leaves marks. And no matter how clever someone thinks they are, if you look carefully enough and long enough, you will find the moment where the numbers stopped telling the truth. I was promoted 3 times in 4 years. By 30, I was a senior investigator. I handled complex cases involving multi-account fraud, forged documentation, and concealed asset transfers. I was good at reading financial behavior, understanding not just what the numbers said, but why someone had moved money the way they did, what they were afraid of, what they were trying to hide. Meanwhile, my family operated in their own world. I saw them at holidays, at my grandfather's birthday dinners, at the occasional family event where my mother would hug me warmly and my father would ask politely about my little accounting job, and Daniel would talk for 45 minutes about whatever new business venture he was launching. I was never close to Daniel. He was charming in the way that people are charming when they want something. He had my father's easy confidence and my mother's ability to make any room feel like it was arranged around him. He had started 3 businesses by the time he was 32. 2 of them had failed. The third was limping along, a real estate development company that always seemed to be one big deal away from becoming something serious. My grandfather helped him, more than once, quietly, without making a scene about it. Gerald was not the kind of man to let his grandson fail in a way that caused public embarrassment, but he also watched Daniel carefully. And I think the watching worried him, because Daniel had a relationship with money that was very different from Gerald's. Gerald believed money was something you built slowly and protected carefully. Daniel believed money was something that should move, that should be deployed, that should be working at all times. What Daniel really believed, though he would never say it, was that money was something other people were holding for him until he was ready to collect it, including, eventually, our grandfather's money. I didn't see any of this clearly back then. I was living my own life. I had my work. I had my apartment. I had a small, close circle of friends who knew nothing about my family dynamics, and I liked it that way. I spoke to my grandfather every Sunday. Every Sunday, without fail, I called him at 7 in the evening, and we talked for 30 to 45 minutes. About his week, about mine, about whatever he had been reading or thinking about. He was curious about my work, not in a nosy way, in the way of a man who respected expertise and wanted to understand how things worked. He never told me about the will. I think he was protecting me, keeping the knowledge away from me so that I wouldn't carry the weight of it. Or maybe he thought that if I didn't know, there was nothing my family could do to use me to get to it. He was a wise man in almost every way, but he underestimated what my father and brother were capable of, and he didn't live long enough to see the full shape of what they had done. My grandfather died in February, 3 years before I found his name in my case file. He died quietly, in his own bed, at 81 years old. He had lived a good life, and he died at the end of it, which is more than most people get. I flew back to Ohio for the funeral. I stood at the graveside in the cold, and I held myself very still the way I always held myself at difficult moments. After the funeral, my father told me the estate was being handled by an attorney and that everything was in order. I asked if I needed to be present for anything. He said no. He said it kindly. He was always kind to me at the moments that mattered most. That was the thing I could never quite resolve. My father was not a cruel man. He was a weak one. There is a difference. A cruel man enjoys taking from you. A weak man just never finds the courage to stop. I went back to my apartment, back to my work, and 2 years passed. I did not receive any communication about my grandfather's estate. I assumed Gerald had left everything to my father, which was his right. I was not expecting anything. I had never been told to expect anything. It didn't occur to me that there was something to find. Not until that Tuesday morning in October. Not until I opened that folder and saw my grandfather's name. Case file number 2247. Let me tell you how financial fraud investigations actually work, because it matters for what I'm about to tell you. When a financial institution, a bank, a brokerage, a trust administrator, identifies unusual account activity, they flag it for review. Sometimes they handle it internally. Sometimes they refer it to outside investigators. Our firm worked on referrals from banks, estate attorneys, and occasionally directly from district attorneys' offices when the evidence suggested criminal activity. Case file 2247 came to us from a referral by the trust administrator at a regional bank in Ohio. The administrator, a careful, methodical woman named Patricia, had been reviewing the activity on an estate trust account when she noticed a pattern that concerned her. A significant sum of money had moved through the account in a series of transactions that, individually, each fell just below the reporting threshold. It's a technique called structuring. It's illegal, and it's one of the clearest signals that someone is trying to move money without leaving a clean trail. Patricia flagged it. The bank referred it to our firm. My supervisor assigned it to me because I had handled 3 structuring cases in the previous 18 months, and I was considered one of the strongest investigators on that type of pattern. He handed me the folder on a Monday afternoon. I took it home that evening with the intention of doing a preliminary review before our morning briefing. I opened it at my kitchen table at 9 p.m. The account name stopped me cold. The Gerald R. Whitfield Estate Trust. I sat there for a moment. Just sat there in my kitchen with the folder open in front of me and the sounds of the city coming through my window. Then I turned to the next page. The authorized signatories on the trust account were Robert Whitfield, my father, and Daniel Whitfield, my brother. The trust had been established following my grandfather's death and was supposed to be administered according to his will. I turned to the next page. There was a summary of transactions that Patricia had flagged. Over a period of 14 months, $487,000 had been moved out of the estate trust through a series of structured withdrawals. The money had flowed into 2 separate holding accounts, and from there into what appeared to be personal and business accounts. One of those business accounts belonged to Daniel's real estate company. I turned one more page. There was a note in Patricia's referral document. She had attempted to locate the controlling estate document, the will, to verify that the account activity was authorized. She had found a will on file, but she noted and had flagged that the will appeared to have been amended. There was a codicil, a modification, filed approximately 8 months before my grandfather's death. The codicil removed the 1/3 provision for me entirely. It removed the charitable bequests. It directed the full estate to be divided between my father and my brother, with my father receiving 40% and Daniel receiving 60%. Patricia had compared the signature on the codicil to the signature on the original will. She had noted, in careful professional language, that the signatures appeared inconsistent. I read that line 3 times. Then I closed the folder. I stood up from my kitchen table. I walked to my window and I looked out at the city for a long time. My family had not just cut me out of my grandfather's estate. They had forged his signature to do it. And then, while the estate was supposedly being administered, they had been systematically draining it through illegal structured transfers. They had stolen from me. They had stolen from my grandfather's memory. And they had done it while believing, completely, confidently believing, that I would never know. That quiet little Clara with her small accounting job would never look up from her tax returns long enough to notice. I went back to my kitchen table. I opened a new document on my laptop. I typed, Case File 2247, Personal Recusal Review. And then I picked up my phone and called my supervisor. To recuse or to stay? My supervisor's name is Marcus Webb. He has been in financial investigations for 22 years. He is not a dramatic man. He does not panic. He does not make quick decisions. When I called him at 9:30 that Monday evening and told him what I had found, there was a long silence on the line. Then he said, Clara, are you certain about the family connection? I told him I was certain. Another silence. Come in at 7 tomorrow morning, he said. Don't touch the file tonight. I didn't sleep. I lay in my bed and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about my grandfather. I thought about those Sunday phone calls. I thought about Saturday mornings at the hardware store and $20 bills pressed into my palm with the words, That's yours, Clara. Not for the family, for you. I thought about the last time I had seen him, Thanksgiving, the year before he died. He had pulled me aside after dinner, just for a moment, just the 2 of us in the kitchen while everyone else was in the living room. He had held my hand, and he had looked at me very steadily, and he said, You know I've always been proud of you. Whatever happens, you remember that. I had thought it was just something grandparents say. I had hugged him and said, Of course, Grandpa, of course. Whatever happens. He knew. He must have known by then that something was wrong, that someone had gotten access to his documents, that the careful plans he had made for me were under threat. He was trying to tell me something. I just didn't have the context to hear it. At 7 the next morning, I was in Marcus's office with the folder on his desk between us. He read through Patricia's referral carefully. He asked me several precise questions about my relationship to the account holders. He pulled out a legal pad and made notes in his small, exact handwriting. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at me. "You have two options," he said. "You recuse yourself entirely. You hand the file to another investigator, you disclose your connection, and you have no further involvement." "And the second option?" I asked. "You stay on the case. But it gets complicated. Defense attorneys will challenge your objectivity. The opposing side will argue personal motive. It creates vulnerabilities in the case that we would have to work very hard to manage." I thought about that. "How strong is the evidence so far?" I asked. "Based on the referral alone? Strong enough to open a formal investigation. The structuring pattern is textbook. The signature inconsistency on the codicil is a significant red flag. Patricia did good work. If I recuse, who takes it?" He named two of my colleagues. They were good. Both of them were good. But I had worked cases like this for 9 years, and I knew with the certainty of long professional experience that I could build this case better than anyone else in our firm. Not because of personal motivation, because I understood the family dynamics, because I knew the history of the accounts, because I had spent a decade developing an instinct for exactly this type of concealed fraud, and because, if I am being completely honest with myself, I needed to understand the full shape of what had been done. Not for revenge. I want to be clear about that. For truth. For my grandfather. "I'll recuse from the primary role," I said finally. "But I want to serve as a consulting investigator. Full disclosure on file. Every decision reviewed by a second senior investigator. I stay in a supporting role and I don't sign off on the final report." Marcus considered this for a moment. "That works," he said. "But Clara, I need you to be honest with me at every step. If your judgment gets compromised, you tell me immediately." "It won't." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm agreeing to this." He picked up the folder. "Let's find out what your family actually did." Following the money. The formal investigation into the Gerald R. Whitfield Estate Trust opened on a Wednesday. My colleague, a senior investigator named Thomas Okafor, was assigned as lead. Thomas was methodical, experienced, and completely without sentiment when it came to financial crime. He was exactly the right person for this. I briefed him fully. I disclosed everything: my relationship to the account holders, the nature of my grandfather's estate, the family history as I understood it. Thomas listened carefully and asked sharp questions. He was not sympathetic in the way some people try to be when they learn personal details. He was professional, which is what I needed. We began with the documents. The first priority was the codicil, the amendment to my grandfather's will that had removed me from the estate. Patricia had flagged the signature as potentially inconsistent, but potentially inconsistent is not a legal standard. We needed a forensic document examiner. We sent both the original will and the codicil to an independent examiner, a woman with 30 years of experience in question document analysis. Her name was Dr. Evelyn Shore. While we waited for Dr. Shore's analysis, Thomas and I began mapping the financial transactions. The structured withdrawals from the estate trust followed a clear pattern. Every withdrawal was between $9,000 and $9,800, deliberately kept below the $10,000 federal reporting threshold. They occurred at irregular intervals, never two in the same week, never a predictable pattern that would be easy to spot in a casual review. But when you mapped them all together, when you laid out 14 months of transactions on a timeline, the shape of it was unmistakable. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. That level of sophistication pointed to deliberate planning. This wasn't opportunistic fraud. Someone had sat down and worked out a strategy for moving money without triggering automatic alerts. Someone who understood how financial monitoring worked. I thought about Daniel's failed businesses, the real estate company that always needed more capital. Daniel had investors. Daniel had lenders. Daniel had dealt with banks and financial institutions throughout his business career. He had learned something along the way. We followed the money from the estate trust into the two holding accounts. From the holding accounts, the trail split. One branch went into a personal account in my father's name. The deposits into that account were erratic, sometimes large, sometimes small, no clear pattern, which suggested my father was drawing on it as needed rather than following Daniel's more structured approach. The other branch went into Daniel's real estate company. Specifically, it went into an operating account that Daniel had been using to fund development costs on a commercial property project he had been promoting to investors for 2 years. Here was where it got interesting. Because Daniel's investor prospectus, which I pulled from public filings, described the project as being funded entirely through investor capital and a commercial mortgage. There was no mention of estate funds, no disclosure that a significant portion of his operating capital was coming from an estate account that belonged to a dead man's trust. His investors had no idea where their money was actually going. This was not just estate fraud. This had implications for investor fraud as well. Thomas and I looked at each other across the conference table when we mapped this out. "This is bigger than the estate," Thomas said. "Yes," I said. "Your family is in serious trouble." I nodded. I felt something complicated in my chest, a tightness that was not quite sadness, and not quite satisfaction, and not quite anything I had a clean name for. I thought of my grandfather driving his old truck, tipping the same waitress every Friday, working 30 years to build something real so that after he was gone, the people he loved would be taken care of. And then I thought of that money flowing into Daniel's failed real estate project, dollar by dollar, $9,000 at a time. "Let's keep going," I said. Dr. Shore's findings. Dr. Evelyn Shore delivered her report on a Friday afternoon, 18 days into the investigation. She was a small woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a very precise way of speaking. She came to our offices in person, which she said she preferred to do when her findings were significant. Thomas and I sat across from her at the conference table. She opened her case and laid out 2 sets of documents, enlarged, annotated copies of the original will and the disputed codicil. "I'll give you my conclusions first," she said. "The signature on the codicil is not authentic. The person who signed it was not Gerald Raymond Whitfield." She paused to let that land. "The evidence for this conclusion is substantial. I'll walk you through the key indicators." She had annotated the signatures in detail. The original will had been signed by my grandfather at 3 different points across a document drafted over multiple pages. Dr. Shore had analyzed the pen pressure, the letter formation, the natural variations that occur in authentic handwriting, and the baseline alignment, the invisible line along which a person naturally writes. Authentic signatures from the same person show what we call controlled variation, she explained. They're not identical. No 2 genuine signatures from the same person are ever precisely identical, but they share fundamental characteristics. The same pressure points, the same natural hesitations, the same characteristic letter forms. She pointed to the original signatures. These 3 examples are consistent with each other. They show the natural variation of authentic handwriting from the same individual. The pen pressure is heavier on the downstrokes, consistent with how Mr. Whitfield naturally held a pen. The capital G has a characteristic loop that is present in all 3 examples. Then she pointed to the codicil. The signature on the codicil shows several problems. The pen pressure is different, more uniform, which is actually a sign of someone trying to be careful rather than writing naturally. The baseline alignment is slightly off. The signature sits lower on the signature line than Mr. Whitfield's authentic signatures consistently do, and the capital G, the first letter of his last name, lacks the characteristic loop. She looked at us both steadily. "In my professional opinion, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, the signature on this codicil was not written by Gerald Raymond Whitfield. It was written by someone attempting to replicate his signature." Thomas asked several detailed technical questions. Dr. Shore answered each one with the same precise confidence. Her methodology was bulletproof. She had been doing this for 30 years, and she knew exactly how her findings would be challenged in court, and she had already accounted for every objection. When she left, Thomas and I sat quietly for a moment. "We need to establish who signed it," Thomas said. "Yes," I said. "And we need to know how the codicil got filed. Who prepared it? Which attorney's office submitted it to probate?" I had already pulled the probate records. The codicil had been submitted by a small legal practice, not Harold Pruitt's original firm, which had been absorbed by that point, but a separate firm that had apparently been retained by my father to handle the estate administration. The attorney of record was a man named Gregory Slade. Gregory Slade had a modest practice. He handled wills, trusts, small estate matters. His office was 12 miles from my father's house in Ohio. "Let's find out how long Gregory Slade has known my father," I said. Gregory Slade's paper trail. Gregory Slade had been a practicing attorney for 19 years. His record was clean. No disciplinary actions, no bar complaints. He had a modest professional reputation. Not exceptional, not troubling. He handled straightforward estate matters and real estate closings and the occasional small business contract. He had first appeared in my father's financial records 4 years ago, right around the time Harold Pruitt retired. That timing was not a coincidence. We subpoenaed Slade's billing records related to the Whitfield estate. The subpoena went through the appropriate legal channels. At this point, the investigation had been formally referred to the district attorney's office in Ohio, which meant we had law enforcement resources available. Slade's billing records told a story. He had been retained by my father approximately 2 months after Harold Pruitt announced his retirement. His initial engagement was described as estate planning consultation. Over the following 18 months, while my grandfather was still alive, Slade had billed for numerous meetings with my father and multiple sessions described as document preparation. The codicil amending my grandfather's will had been prepared during this period. Slade had filed the codicil with the probate court 5 months before my grandfather's death. Think about that. My grandfather was still alive when that codicil was filed. Gerald Whitfield was a living, breathing human being when a document bearing his forged signature was submitted to a court of law. My father had started this process before Gerald was gone. He had not even waited. Thomas flagged this to the DA's office. The implications were significant. Filing a forged document with a court while the purported signatory is still alive is a serious criminal matter. It went beyond estate fraud into territory that involved active document fraud against a living person. The DA's office moved faster after that. They brought Slade in for a voluntary interview. I was not in the room for that interview. I was not permitted to be. But Thomas was there in a consulting capacity, and he debriefed me afterward. Slade had arrived with his own attorney. He had answered some questions and declined to answer others. But in the course of the interview, faced with the billing records and the document timeline, he had said something significant. He had said that the codicil had been presented to him as a document that Gerald Whitfield had dictated, but was physically unable to sign himself due to declining health. He said my father had told him that Gerald had authorized a trusted family member to sign on his behalf. He said he had not independently verified this with my grandfather directly. His attorney stopped him there, but the damage was done. My father had told an attorney that my grandfather was too ill to sign his own documents. My grandfather, at that time, had been in good health. He had been driving himself to the hardware store. He had been calling me every Sunday, sharp and present and fully himself. My father had lied to the attorney, and Slade, whether through negligence or willful blindness, had accepted that lie and filed the document. When they found out. I need to tell you about the moment my father learned that an investigation was underway. He found out not from me, but from a notice delivered by the DA's office, a formal letter informing him that the Gerald R. Whitfield Estate Trust was under investigation for potential fraud and that he should retain legal counsel. He called me that same evening. I had been half expecting the call. Thomas had warned me it was coming, and we had discussed how I should handle it. I was not to discuss the investigation. I was not to confirm or deny my involvement. I was to listen and to document the call. I answered, "Clara, My father's voice was the same as it had always been, that careful, measured tone he used when he was managing a situation. "I need to talk to you about something." "Okay," I said. "I received a letter today about your grandfather's estate, some kind of investigation." A pause. "I was wondering if you'd heard anything about this at your firm." And there it was. He thought I might know something through my work. He didn't yet know I was directly connected to the case. He was fishing, testing the water. "I can't discuss anything related to active cases," I said. "Perfectly honest, perfectly professional." Of course, of course." Another pause. "This is clearly just some bureaucratic misunderstanding. The estate was administered completely properly. Everything was by the book." "I'm sure your attorney can help you respond to whatever was sent," I said. "Yes." A beat of silence. "Clara, your grandfather's estate. You know he left things to your father and to Daniel. That was his decision. He wanted to take care of his son and his grandson." This was the moment. He was preemptively explaining to me why I had received nothing. He was making sure I understood that this was right, that this was what had been intended. He was making sure I wasn't angry. "I understood," I said quietly. And I did understand. I understood everything now. We said goodbye politely. We hung up. I sat in my apartment in the quiet for a long moment. Then I opened my laptop and I typed up a complete record of the call. Time, duration, summary of everything said. I sent it to Thomas and to the DA's office contact. My father called Daniel that same night. We know this because Daniel's phone records were obtained as part of the investigation. There was a 47-minute call between my father and my brother at 9:14 p.m. We don't know exactly what was said, but the next morning, Daniel called Gregory Slade. And the morning after that, Gregory Slade's attorney contacted the DA's office and indicated that his client wished to cooperate with the investigation. When the structure fails, financial fraud cases, in my experience, tend to hold together until they don't. And when they stop holding together, they fall apart very quickly. Gregory Slade's cooperation was the first crack. Slade was facing potential criminal exposure. Filing a fraudulent document with a court is not a small matter, even if he had been deceived about the nature of what he was filing. His attorney negotiated a cooperation agreement. In exchange for full disclosure and truthful testimony, Slade would receive consideration from the DA's office. What Slade provided was significant. He had records of every meeting with my father. He had notes from those meetings. And he had, crucially, a recording. Slade had started recording his client meetings approximately 3 years ago, following a dispute with a previous client over what had been discussed in a consultation. He had installed a small digital recorder in his office and kept copies of all recordings as professional protection. He had not mentioned this to my father. The recordings from his meetings with Robert Whitfield were extraordinary. In the first meeting, my father explained that his father was not in his right mind regarding certain estate decisions and that the family needed to make sure the assets were protected. He talked about Daniel's business and how much potential it had. He talked about how my grandfather had never really understood the business world and had made decisions based on sentiment rather than logic. He never once mentioned me by name. In a later meeting, my father discussed the codicil specifically. He explained that his father had verbally expressed a desire to change his estate plans, but was too proud to do it formally because he didn't want to admit he had made a mistake. This was my father's explanation for why the codicil bore a forged signature. His father had wanted this change but hadn't made it himself. Robert Whitfield had simply helped him do what he wanted to do. This is what my father had told himself. I believe that truly. I believe he had constructed a story in his own mind in which he was not a fraudster, but a practical man solving a problem his sentimental old father had created. This is how people do terrible things. They tell themselves a story that makes the terrible thing make sense. The recording also captured my father and Slade discussing the structured withdrawals. My father had asked Slade specifically about how to access the estate trust funds before the estate was fully settled. Slade had explained the proper legal mechanisms, and then my father had described what he actually intended to do, which was not the proper legal mechanism. Slade had not stopped him. That was Slade's exposure. With those recordings in hand, the DA's office moved to formal charges. My father was charged with document fraud, forgery, and financial exploitation of a deceased person's estate. Daniel was charged with receipt of fraudulently obtained funds and investor fraud. The latter related to the undisclosed transfer of estate funds into his investor-backed real estate project. Gregory Slade was charged with 1 count of filing a false instrument, reduced from 2 charges in exchange for his cooperation. The charges were filed on a Thursday morning. My father called me that afternoon. I did not answer. In the courtroom. The preliminary hearing was held on a gray morning in November, in a courthouse in Ohio that smelled of old carpet and institutional coffee. I sat in the gallery. I was not a witness at this stage. I was there as an observer, as someone who had a right to be present and who needed to see this with her own eyes. My father came in with his attorney. He was wearing a dark suit. His hair was neatly combed. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe I was just seeing him differently now. When you understand what someone has done, they look different. The same face, the same eyes, but the familiar warmth of them gone, replaced by something you can see through now. He saw me in the gallery. His face went very still. We looked at each other for a long moment. I did not look away. I did not show him anything. No anger, no sadness, no accusation. I just looked at him calmly and directly, the way I look at the documents in a case that I have fully understood. He looked away first. Daniel came in separately, with his own attorney. He did not look at me at all. He sat down and focused on his lawyer's face and kept his jaw tight throughout the proceeding. My mother was not there. She and my father had separated in the month since the charges were filed. I did not know the details. I had not spoken to her. The hearing itself was procedural. The judge reviewed the charges. The attorneys entered appearances. Bail was addressed. A trial date was set. But there was one moment that I want to tell you about. My father's attorney made a preliminary argument. He stated that the evidence in the case was tainted by the involvement of a family member, meaning me, in the investigation. He argued that my participation as a consulting investigator compromised the integrity of the process. The judge listened carefully. Then she asked the prosecution to respond. The assistant DA, a sharp, steady woman named Renee Howell, explained that my involvement had been fully disclosed from the beginning, that I had served only in a consulting capacity, that the lead investigator, Thomas Okafor, had made all primary determinations independently, that every one of my contributions to the case had been reviewed and verified by a second senior investigator, and that the core evidence, Dr. Shore's forensic document analysis, Gregory Slade's recordings, and the financial transaction records, was entirely independent of anything I had personally gathered. The judge considered this. Then she said, "The objection is noted. It does not affect the validity of the evidence as presented." She moved on. I sat very still in the gallery and I breathed slowly and steadily. My father's attorney had tried to make my involvement the story. He had tried to turn the fact that I was a professional in this field into evidence of a personal vendetta. The judge had looked at the evidence and seen it for what it was. That was the moment I understood, fully, completely, that this was going to reach its conclusion, regardless of anything my family tried to do. What came after? The trial took place the following spring. I won't walk you through every day of it. I'll tell you the shape of it. My father's defense argued that he had genuinely believed he was acting in accordance with his father's wishes, that Gerald had been confused in his final years and had made estate decisions that didn't reflect his true intentions, that Robert Whitfield had only been trying to ensure a fair outcome. The prosecution played the recordings from Gregory Slade's office. They presented Dr. Shore's forensic analysis. They presented 14 months of financial records showing systematic structured withdrawals. They presented evidence that at the time the codicil was filed, my grandfather had been fully mentally competent. His physician testified to this. His Sunday phone calls to me were referenced. Neighbors and friends who had regular contact with him in that period spoke to his clarity. The jury deliberated for 2 days. My father was convicted on 2 of 3 counts: the forgery charge and the financial exploitation charge. The document fraud charge was merged with the forgery conviction. Daniel was convicted on the investor fraud charge. The receipt of fraudulently obtained funds charge resulted in a hung jury on that count. Ultimately, the DA declined to retry it, given the conviction on investor fraud. Gregory Slade received a suspended sentence in exchange for his cooperation. My father was sentenced to 4 years. His attorney negotiated it down to 4 years with possibility of parole after 2, given his age and lack of prior criminal history. Daniel received 3 years and was required to make full restitution to his investors. The estate trust, or what remained of it, was ordered to be redistributed according to my grandfather's authentic original will. After the withdrawals and the legal costs, the value had been significantly reduced. But there was still something there. My portion, the 1/3 that Gerald had intended for me, came to approximately $310,000. I donated $100,000 of it to a financial literacy nonprofit that works with elderly adults on protecting their assets from exploitation. Grandpa would have liked that, I think. The rest I put somewhere safe, the way he taught me. What I carry now. After the sentencing, I walked out of the courthouse into bright spring sunlight. Thomas was beside me. He had been beside me through the whole process, steady, professional, exactly the colleague I had needed him to be. "You did good work," he said. "We did good work," I said. He nodded. "What happens now?" I thought about that. "I go back to work," I said. "Same as always." He smiled slightly. "Just like that?" "Just like that." We said goodbye in the parking lot. I drove to my grandfather's grave on the way home. I don't know exactly why. It wasn't planned. I just found myself turning onto the road that led to the cemetery, and I didn't turn back. I stood at his grave for a while. I told him what had happened. I told him about Dr. Shore and the characteristic loop on the capital G. I told him about Patricia and her careful eye for structuring patterns. I told him about Thomas and Marcus and Renee Howell and all the steady, serious people who had done their jobs well and brought this to where it ended. I told him I was sorry it had taken this long. I told him I heard him now. Whatever happens, you remember that. I remember, Grandpa. I remember everything. There are people in my family's story who ask me if I feel guilty, if I feel responsible for what happened to my father. If I wish I had found a way to handle things privately, within the family, without involving courts and prosecutors and criminal charges. I have thought about this question carefully. My answer is no. Not because I don't still love my father in some complicated way that I haven't fully sorted out yet. I probably do. Not because I wanted to see him in a courtroom. I didn't. But because what he did was not a private matter. He forged a dead man's name. He stole from a trust that belonged to the people my grandfather had loved. He looked me in the eye at a funeral and told me everything was handled and everything was in order, and he knew what he had done. Some things cannot be handled privately. Some wrongs are too large to absorb quietly and move on from. My grandfather spent 60 years building something, working carefully and honestly and with his eyes open. He made plans. He thought about the people he would leave behind, and he tried to take care of them. What my father did, what both of them did, was decide that their own needs mattered more than his wishes, more than his memory, more than the people he had loved. I could not let that stand. I would not. What this story taught me. I want to leave you with something real. Not just the outcome, not just the convictions and the redistributed trust and the prison sentences. Those are just facts. Facts are the skeleton of a story. They're not the meaning of it. The meaning of this story, for me, is about what we owe each other as families. We owe each other honesty. We owe each other the basic decency of not betraying someone's trust while their body is still in the ground. We owe the people who love us the dignity of their own decisions, even when those decisions don't benefit us, even when we think we know better, even when we have convinced ourselves that we are only trying to fix something that shouldn't have been a problem to begin with. My father convinced himself he was a reasonable man making a practical decision. My brother convinced himself he was just using a resource that should have been available to him anyway. Neither of them allowed themselves to see what they were actually doing. That gap, between what we tell ourselves and what we are actually doing, is where almost every betrayal lives. I spent 9 years learning to find the truth in financial records. The truth is always in there. Numbers don't lie the way people do. They don't rationalize. They don't construct comforting narratives. They just record what happened. That is both the gift and the burden of the work.